But tonight's not about those voters. It's about the undecided. It's the people who cannot make up their mind yet.
Joining me this week, Conservative strategist Evan Menzies, Liberal strategist Sabrina Grover, and Calgary pollster Janet Brown. Okay, as we are taping this, the French debate is underway, so needless to say, the focus of this conversation will be on the English debate. But Janet, before we get into that, I just want to see if you can set the stage for us as the pollster here. What's your read on the state of the race based on the numbers that you've been paying attention to?
Well, there's a little bit of variation in the polls, but they all point to the same general conclusion that the Liberals are ahead, and it's just a case of how much. And so going into tonight, Mark Carney is trying to turn a Liberal victory into a Liberal majority. He's the front runner, and he's probably going to try and maintain his front runner status. Now, the Conservatives, their support has not really sunk over the course of the election campaign. The problem for them is support for the Liberals have grown. So Pierre Poilievre is going to be trying to convert some current Liberal supporters over to the Conservative side. He's running from behind. He is going to try and cast some doubts on Mark Carney. And then, of course, it's we've got the other parties, the Bloc and the NDP. They are really fighting for their existence. They want to stay on the electoral map.
Before I move on to the other two, just quickly, do you think the question that most voters will be asking themselves at the ballot box, the so-called ballot question, is locked in at this point?
Well, I think for most voters, the ballot question is Donald Trump and tariffs and who is best able to manage those things. And so I think a lot of the voters who are locked in right now are thinking about that. But tonight's not about those voters. It's about the undecided. It's the people who cannot make up their mind yet. And one of the reasons they cannot make up their mind is they have a bigger diversity of issues, or they just haven't really thought about things yet. So maybe tonight those voters are going to want to hear more about affordability, the Liberal government's track record. Here in Alberta, people are going to want to hear about pipelines and those sorts of things. So there's one main ballot question, but there's more than just one.
All right, with all that context in mind, thank you, Janet. Let's get right into it. Evan, what's Pierre Poilievre's number one job going into the English debate? Is it framing that preferred ballot question, or is it trying to tear the front runner down, Mark Carney, something else? Your candidate's top priority in your mind?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of objectives. I think Janet touched on one piece, which is that the Liberal coalition isn't reflective of soaking votes away from the Conservatives. It's reflective of regaining previous support and soaking away support from traditional NDP and also BQ voters in Quebec. So I think one of his objectives needs to remind those voters that of the Liberal Party record for the past 10 years, and that Mark Carney was a key architect of a lot of the economic policies that Canadians more broadly just were and generally were quite upset with. And to be able to effectively tie that record and shake loose and unmoor that current coalition of voters that the Liberal Party has put together. The second piece would be to look prime ministerial, be ready for the job. People are looking for what's next, and one of the big advantages that Mark Carney has had is the glow of being a new prime minister, especially in the challenges that Canada is facing with the U.S. tariff threat. Mm-hmm. And so, can Pierre manage to convince enough Canadians during this debate that he's the man for the job and shake loose enough Liberal support to give him a shot on Election Day?
Evan's on a first-name basis with him. That's awesome. We've got the right pundit on the panel. All right, Sabrina, what about your leader? What should Mark Carney be aiming to achieve above all else in that English debate?
Well, I think if I was Mark Carney and the Mark Carney team, I would try to remember how we got to this point in the polls and why we're here. And it's not because of the decade of policies that we've built, it's because of the Trump factor. And Mark Carney is the right person for this moment, for this job moving forward. And he needs to make that very clear. He needs to be the kind of CEO version, I think, of the prime minister that he has been so far, that he's been showing up to Ottawa to have those cabinet meetings, to have those meetings where he's talking and responding to tariffs. And I think that he also has to remember and kind of embody this, what I'm going to pull from Doug Ford. 30% of people who voted for Doug Ford in the last election voted for change. Because people think Doug Ford has changed, even though he's been the premier for 2 terms prior to that. And I think that Carney needs to embody that. People are voting for change, but that change doesn't mean a change of party. It means a change of leader, a change of approach, and that changes Carney. And what I would just wanted to respond to Evan here talking about, trying to shake loose some of those voters. I think that that's almost an impossible task, right? Because every time Pierre Poilievre speaks, the NDP voters get scared and they move towards Carney. And so I don't really know what perspective or angle or message Pierre could take to get those NDP voters back to the NDP, because you're certainly not bringing them back to the Conservatives. Those are NDP voters that have come over to the Liberals, right? I mean, I'm in Jagmeet Singh right now. I know longtime NDP voters are voting Liberal. So I don't see that happening for Pierre.
Janet, do you want to pick up on any of what you just heard there, or do you want to hear my next question?
Well, I was just going to say, I agree with Sabrina. I think it's hard to imagine the voter who would have voted for Trudeau but won't vote for Mark Carney. So that's why it is so hard for the Conservatives to get votes away from the Liberals. So it's really the Conservatives' best hope is that that far left voters just feel uncomfortable with Mark Carney and go back to their traditional vote.
Okay, well, I'll go back to you. We talked about what the 2 frontrunners need to do in the English debate. Janet, what do they not need to do? What do they need to avoid doing?
Well, Pierre Poilievre needs to avoid looking annoying. He needs to avoid looking harsh. He needs to avoid, the things that turn centrist voters off are his demeanor. He needs to look like he is a calm, cool, collected person. He's got to look like a prime minister, in short. Mark Carney has to be just careful not to make any mistakes. French is obviously a bigger problem for him, but as well in English. And Carney can have a bit of a thick skin too, when he's asked about his personal finances, when he's asked about Brookfield, that sort of thing. As I said earlier, I know Albertans are going to want to hear the answer to his questions on pipelines. So he has to be very careful that he's got good responses to those things, and he doesn't fall back on his own prickliness.
You nailed it.
You know what I meant.
Yeah. Evan, Conservatives I know are worried about Poilievre while at the same time relishing the thought of him reenacting that interaction he had with Mark Carney via a Commons committee that many of us have seen YouTube clips of over the years, where Poilievre was doing the Poilievre thing. He was going razor sharp at him with tone, and we know that that is a strength of his. They want to see it, but at the same time, they're worried that that might turn people off. What are you worried about when it comes to your cabinet, or when it comes to your candidate?
Obviously during a debate, you don't want to be seen as off-putting. You want to be seen as someone who you can sit in someone's living room with and have a good conversation about whatever. I think one of the things that Conservatives should be encouraged by, I won't pretend to butcher the name. Well, at least I'll try the Tout le Monde program with Radio Canada in Quebec. When he was on that with Mark Carney a few days ago, I thought he presented the exact tone that I would be looking for as his debate team. Reasonable, a little bit self-effacing, but able to prosecute his case and prosecute what he wanted to with addressing the contrast that he wants to propose against the Liberals. I think Mark Carney has some weaknesses where he can, if the tone is right, put Mark Carney in an uncomfortable position during the debate if they have a chance to go one-to-one based on the format. So that's what I'd be looking for, just a reasonable tone, but be able to act as an effective prosecutor as well.
And Sabrina, are you worried about anything when it comes to Carney? Janet mentioned his thin skin at times.
I mean, certainly I think debates can change the layout of an election. I mean, we all remember, like, math is hard as a comment in 2015 in this province. So I think, those moments do go viral. People aren't watching the whole debate, but they are going to watch those viral moments. I think for Carney, again, he just has to be that CEO version of the prime minister. And I would say that the other advice I'd give is not to treat Pierre Poilievre in this moment like Donald Trump, because Pierre Poilievre does have a lot of Trumpy moments, and he does that all in the rallies. He does it all by himself. But this is not going to be the moment to prosecute him like Trump. I think Carney has to be the man that people want to vote for, and that Pierre is, on his own going to be the person that people want to vote against. And so I think that if I
Why
was
do you say that? Can I just interrupt? Why not try to frame Pierre Poilievre as Trump light? Because that frame, whether it's Carney putting him in there, seems to be working for the people who are supporting the Liberals. What's important about not doing that?
Because I think that the moment is to frame Mark Carney as the person to fight Donald Trump, the actual Donald Trump, not to fight Pierre Poilievre, the Donald Trump, as Karina Gould once put it, like Timbit Trump. I think that he needs to put his focus on what he's good at, which is pushing back against the United States, against these tariffs, and standing up for Canada, and really appear like that strong, stable, serious leader that Canadians are looking for. I think that Pierre on his own is going to delve likely into perhaps the same vibe we've seen at his rallies, where he does become Trump-like. But I don't think that Carney can prosecute that case. I think Pierre can prosecute that case enough. And I think they can clip those and prosecute the case through ads later. But it's all about how the defense themselves.
Yeah, we can't lose sight of the fact that a lot of people will come to the debate via those little clips rather than watching the debate. Both Evan and Sabrina, Janet, pointing to what we've heard many times before, that the candidates don't have to worry about the opponents as much as they have to worry about themselves and showcasing themselves as prime ministerial. Sound advice for any leader in any debate?
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to what Sabrina said. Mark Carney doesn't want to make Trump look like, or doesn't want to make Poilievre look like Trump. He probably also doesn't want to bring Danielle Smith into this debate as well. That'll make things contentious. Carney needs the most boring, forgettable debate possible. That's the best strategy when you're the front runner. Poilievre may try and manufacture some viral moments, but Carney just needs to keep it cool because that's how he's going to maintain his advantage.
Staying with you, Janet, I think it's fair to say that expectations are higher than usual for a federal leaders debate, given how we got here, right? The Conservatives losing a 25-point lead in the polls, an unelected Liberal leader stepping into the Prime Minister's office, and the external threat of the U.S. president keeps talking about annexing Canada. All of that said, most of the time, most debates don't move the needle in public opinion. Any reason to think that won't be the case this time?
Yeah, no, but debates really rarely have an impact, but man, when they do, it's exciting, right? So we all watch these debates just in case it's one of those really memorable ones, but 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be very memorable. Yes, people are very tuned into these debates because this election came together so quickly. Mark Carney's so new, but at the same time, it is late in the process, and we don't have a lot of undecideds left in this race. Advanced voting starts Friday, I think. So it's probably going to be a snoozer, but it could be really exciting. Who knows?
And Evan, with people going to the polls as soon as Friday, if it's not the debate, what do the Conservatives have in terms of another card that they can play this late in the game to turn the tide and get their numbers up?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, their greatest strength and asset is that their floor, their base is extremely high and it's extremely motivated. Whereas the Liberal base is, I would say, or their floor is, it exists and their coalition exists and it's together, but it's less of a motivated base than the Conservative base. So what the Conservatives really need to focus in on with the advance vote turning in and everything else is taking advantage of that energy that they have on their side and using it as much to their advantage as possible. And as part of their goal, what we've mentioned earlier is if they can at least give a sense to NDP voters, Bloc voters, that even holding their nose for the Liberal ticket, for the Carney ticket, isn't worth their time. That's to their advantage in the last 14 days here. But after the debates are over, with advance polls open, it becomes ground game, and that's the only card that they have left, and they'll have to push really hard and get every single vote that they have. There's a lot of traditional non-voters that are energized Conservative voters right now, and that's a bit of a card that they have in their back pocket.
All right, Sabrina, you get to wrap us up here. And given that the national polling numbers, at least according to CBC's poll tracker, have tightened a little bit in the last few days, I'm wondering if you're worried that the Liberals may have peaked too soon, or maybe that Jagmeet Singh might have the performance of his life and siphon off some of those Liberal votes.
I think that of course, yeah, the national numbers have certainly tightened up a little bit, but what hasn't tightened up is that staggering lead in Ontario and Quebec. And then you have, Doug Ford and Nick Clavakis leaning in on that staggering lead in Ontario earlier this week. And so that I think is somewhere between a 12 and 15 point lead, depending on the polls you're looking at in Ontario. It's about 12 to 15 or 18%, same in Quebec. And I think that is what will really drive the Liberal vote. And I think what's also important, and I've said this on a couple of other programs, is that demographic change. Women are leaving Pierre Poilievre fast and furious, and women are motivated voters, and they're coming out for Carney. And I think that there's very little that's going to draw them back to the NDP. I think they see Carney as somebody who is ready to lead, fit to lead on the tariff issue. And I think that has been a really, really detrimental loss to the Conservatives.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Great conversation. And I know, Sabrina, that Janet was happy to hear you point out that the regional numbers matter more than the top line number. She had a great conversation with yours truly about that. We turned it into a little YouTube video the folks out there can find. Always worth this conversation, talking about what the polls really reveal if you dig into the details. Janet, Sabrina, Evan, so great to have you on.